Hello everyone and welcome to Tariq and welcome to special segment Tariq Classes. And the chapter for today is Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings, a culture development that took place between circa 600 BCE to circa 600 CE. Basically, in the chapter, we'll understand the philosophers of that point, and they're trying to understand the world they live in, and how their thought process we can see being transmitted orally and also written down by people. You can see their thoughts in the buildings, in the architectures. This chapter also focuses on Buddhism, how it spread and how it did not develop in isolation, but a lot of debates took place, and that's how it came into practice.
Now, the first topic is called A Glimpse of Sanchi, and this talks about how in the 19th century, Europeans were very interested in the findings of the stupa at Sanchi. The French had even taken the permission of the Nawab of Bhopal at the time, Shah Jahan Begum, to take away the Eastern Gateway to their museums, and for a while the English were also very invested in doing the same. Luckily for us, they were satisfied with just taking plaster cast replicas of the Eastern Gateway, leaving the original as a part of the original site in the state of Bhopal. Now, if we were able to preserve the ancient site at Sanchi, it was because of the contributions of the Nawab of Bhopal, both Shah Jahan Begum and then her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, who provided the funding for the cause. Now, it is no wonder that John Marshall dedicated his work on Sanchi to Begum, since she funded the setting up of the museum at the site. Not only that, she also funded his stay at the guest house and even the publication of his work. So the very fact that we were able to preserve this ancient site has a lot to do with good luck and wise decisions on the part of the authorities at the time, because us time pe the contractors were also looking for land to lay, railway lines, and even for people to look for artifacts to just take away to museums in other parts of the world. Now, Sanchi is considered one of the most important Buddhist centers in the world, and its discovery has led to a greater understanding of early Buddhism and how the ideas might have developed at that time. Today, it can be said that it also stands as a testament to the restoration work done by the Archaeological Survey of India. But now, this is about how the site was discovered, how it might have been preserved. But what do we learn from the site apart from the fact that it is a Buddhist site? Who built it? Why was it built? When was it built? Who visited the site? Like, what were the functions of this site?
But before understanding the Buddhist tradition, I think we should get into the understanding of the background of it, the early Buddhist traditions. How was the society like? The second topic is the background of sacrifices and debates. So, the mid-first millennium BCE that was a turning point in history. We see a lot of thinkers emerging, like Zarathustra in Iran, Kongze in China, then you have Aristotle, Plato in Greece, then you have Mahavir and Gautam Buddha in India. This was also a time where, they kind of questioned life, the relationship between humans and the cosmic reality, the existence, कि हम क्यों हैं? Why are we living in this world? Why is this world there, and why are we living in it? And this was also the time where society was changing, politics was changing. This was a time where new cities and new kingdoms were emerging, and especially in the Ganga Valley region. So this was a turning point in history. There were several pre-existing religious practices, sacrifices, especially in between 1000 BCE to 500 CE, जिसको हम early Vedic text time भी बोलते हैं and Vedic time भी बोलते हैं, जबकि ऋग वेदा लिखी गई थी, and ऋग वेदा is basically hymns that were, they sang those hymns in praise of deities like Indra, Agni, Som. And especially at the time of sacrifices, when the sacrifices were performed. So these sacrifices were performed by collectively. Earlier they were performed collectively. फिर बाद में क्या हुआ कि the head of the household would perform it, and elaborate sacrifices like Ashwamedh and Rajasuya was performed by the chief or by the king, and they were performed with the help of a Brahmin.
Also, who was telling me कि Rigvedic hymns, if you look at, of course there is a philosophical element to it also, but most of them are like, very materialistic in nature.
Yeah. Obviously kings के लिए
It's like, no, give me cattle, give me this, kill my enemy, give me food, burn that person's house.
Many ideas found in the Upanishads shows that people were very curious about life, death, rebirth, whether our karma or past actions would influence our next birth. Also, people at times who were outside the Vedic, who were outside the Vedic or the Varnas fold, or they often questioned it. They often questioned the single reality. They also questioned the importance of sacrifices. So this was that time phase, where a lot of people who were outside the Vedic sphere or the Vedic folds were questioning the ideologies of Upanishads. They were questioning Vedas at that point of time. We get a glimpse of various discussions and debates taking place at that point of time, especially the Buddhist texts. They tell us that there were 64 school of thoughts at that point of time. So each thought or each person would try to convince a layman through his philosophies, would try to convince anybody that person would meet. Discussions would take place in Kutar Garshala, where this was basically hut with a pointed roof where the mendicants would, rest when they're traveling. And by chance, a philosopher is able to convince his rival through his philosophies. So the rival's followers would start following him. So this was that age where 64 school of thoughts were there. और वो सारा एक दूसरे को इन्फ्लुएंस करने की कोशिश करते थे अपने फिलोसफीज के साथ. Mahavir and Gautam Buddha, both Jainism, Buddhism, they actually questioned the authority of Vedas. They always spoke about how men and women should get away, should liberate themselves from these trials and tribulations, should liberate themselves from this worldly existence, which was in contrast to the Brahminical ideology, where a Brahminical ideology was more materialistic. Also, Brahminical ideology was such that they believed that a person's existence all depended on his caste, his or her caste, or his or her birth.
Basically like your family.
Yeah, family. So, whereas these two cultures that emerged, they questioned this whole authority of Vedas.
The third topic is beyond worldly pleasures, the message of Mahavira. Now, the basic philosophy of the Jainas was already in existence in North India before the birth of Vardhaman, who came to be known as Mahavira in the 6th century BCE. Now, according to the Jain tradition, Mahavira was preceded by 23 other Tirthankaras, and Tirthankaras were the people who guided men and women, or people, to be a more inclusive term, across the river of human existence. The most important idea in the Jain tradition is that the entire world is animated, and in a sense, every object has a life of its own. And it is the ahimsa or non-violence practiced towards these objects, which is of prime importance, specifically to humans, animals, plants, and even insects. Now, this principle of ahimsa or non-violence has left its imprint on Indian philosophy or Indian thinking as a whole. And according to the Jain tradition or the Jain teachings, the cycle of life and rebirth are controlled through one's karma, and in order to break away from the cycle of life and rebirth, one has to practice severe asceticism and penance. Now, in order to break away from the cycle of karma, you have to renounce the world, and in order to renounce the world, you have to take on a monastic existence, and that is a necessary path towards salvation. Jain monks and nuns would undertake a set of 5 vows, and the paramount would be from refraining to kill. They would also not lie. They would not be. They would not steal. They would maintain celibacy, and they would not own property. Now, in the subtopic, the spread of Jainism, they talk about how the tradition was spread throughout the subcontinent in various parts of India, and texts were also procured, and the teachings were, taken down in form of literature in many languages, including Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Tamil. For centuries, the manuscripts were stored in libraries that were attached to temples, and you also find a huge amount of art from the Jain tradition, and these were commissioned by the followers of the various Tirthankaras, and you find them throughout India.
The Buddha and the quest for enlightenment. So, Gautam Buddha was one of the most important teachers and thinkers of that point of time. And his thoughts, his thinking, his dhamma did not only stay within the subcontinent but also traveled across. It traveled through Central Asia to China, to Japan, to Korea, and other places. From the seaside, it went towards Myanmar, to Southeast Asian countries, and it had to Sri Lanka. So it spread across a larger part of the Asian continent. And then the thing is that a lot of but how do we get to know about his teachings? So a lot of historians, they rely on the Buddhist texts that were written. They rely on those traditions, oral traditions, also hagiographies that were written. And most of the things about Buddha were written almost a century after his death, so that they could preserve his teachings. What do we get to know about Gautam Buddha's past is that he was actually a prince who was born in the Sakya clan, and he was known as Siddhartha. He had a very, very protected life at that point of time, and he had no idea about the harsh realities of life. But one day he embarked on a journey. He called his charioteer and he asked him to take him around. And that was the first time उन्होंने अपना कदम रखा था to see the world. And it was very traumatic. So he saw an old man, he saw a diseased man, he saw a corpse. And then he saw a mendicant who knew the reality, who was not bothered about it, who knew that death is the ultimate thing, and he had made peace with it. So Gautam Buddha realized that decay and death, right, that's the reality of life. And he also chose this path, and he left everything, and he embarked on a journey to get the knowledge of his own truth. Siddhartha explored various paths for enlightenment. He also did self-mortification that almost he reached near death. Then he did away with such extreme paths, and he meditated for days, and finally he attained enlightenment, and then he came to be known as Buddha, the enlightened one. And then he embarked on his journey to spread his knowledge, to spread his thought, to spread his dhamma in his lifetime.
Now, the next topic is called the teachings of Buddha, and this talks about literally the teachings of Buddha. Now, what we know of the lessons that one has to learn from the life of Buddha are available, or his life has been reconstructed from the Sutta Pitaka. Now, some stories from the Sutta Pitaka will talk about how Buddha uses miraculous powers to convince people, and some stories talk about how he uses reasoning and persuasion to get his point across. Now, for instance, the NCERT book talks about one instance where a grief-stricken woman goes to the Buddha and laments about the passing of her son. And instead of bringing back her son through miraculous powers, he talks to her about the inevitability of death, how life is so impermanent and that everybody has to die. So that's an example where he uses reasoning instead of powers to convince lay people about his teachings. Now, these stories were also written and probably spoken in the common tongue, which made it more accessible to the lay people as opposed to an official language which was not accessible to the masses. Now, this is a part of the text that gets a little mouthy and difficult to grasp. But so the Buddhist tradition talks about how the world is transient or not permanent, like temporary, anicca, and it is constantly changing. It is also soulless, anatta, and again, there is nothing permanent about the world. Now, within this impermanent world, sorrow is intrinsic to the human existence. Sorrow or dukkha is intrinsic to human existence, and to break away from this path or from this continuous cycle, one has to follow the middle path. Now, it is through following the path of moderation rather than severe penance or self-indulgence that humans can attain freedom from their existence. In the early forms of Buddhism, it wasn't clear if they believed in the existence of a god because it was irrelevant. What was necessary was your own journey and how you navigated through your life. To Buddha, the social relations that we form or the social order that was formed was not of divine origin. It was created by people like you and me. So he would advise kings and Gahabatis to exercise restraint, to be human and ethical in their behavior. Once again, individual effort was what was required or what was believed to transform social relations. Through individual agency and doing righteous deeds is how you could break away from the cycle of rebirth and attain self-realization and nibbana. Nibbana literally means the extinguishing of the ego and desire, and it is through the path of self-actualization that you can attain it, thus ending the cycle of suffering for those who have renounced the world. According to Buddhist tradition, the last words that the Buddha spoke to his disciples was for them to be the lamps to your own selves. So once again, the key to self-realization and to attain nirvana rests with the self and not with anybody else.
Followers of the Buddha. So, जब Buddhism फैला, when Buddha was there, तो एक संघ बन गया. All these teachings and all these disciples, they became a part of the sangha. So people, especially men in the beginning, they became part of the sangha and they were known as bhikkhus. They were supposed to renounce everything and only possess things that were very important for existence. A bowl basically, and they would go and ask for alms from the people, from the laity, and they would get food, especially food for survival. उसके बाद क्या हुआ? There came a change where with the help of Buddha's favorite disciple Anand, he asked Buddha that women should also be allowed to be a part of the sangha. And because of his mediation, women also became a part of the sangha and they were known as bhikkhunis. And the first women to join the sangha was actually Gautam Buddha's foster mother called Mahapajapati Gautami. Women became bhikkhuni and they also started spreading the concept of Dhamma, and they were known as Theris. And these women were respected and they were known as Theris. The basic ideology of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis was to spread the ideas of Dhamma and to renounce all your worldly possessions and only possess things that was important for existence. Buddha's followers came from various social backgrounds: kings, Gahapatis, peasants, merchants. And once they got into the sangha, they all were respected equally. Every individual was equal. They had to leave behind their social background when they entered the sangha. Discussions would take place. So how the system worked in the sangha was it mostly depended on the Gana Sangha. So if there was an issue, they would discuss about that particular issue. Discussions would take place, and by chance, if they don't get an answer for it, they would vote. So that is how the whole sangha worked. Buddhism grew not only during Buddha's lifetime but also after his death, because people were not happy with the social changes, they were not happy with their life. Why Buddhism attracted people who were weaker, who were single, was because it emphasized on values, on conduct, rather than the superiority based on birth. And also the metta, or the fellow feeling, or the karuna, that was the compassion that it emphasized on, that attracted people who thought they were weaker, rather than the other traditions. So that is why Buddhism became very famous. It grew during this point of time.
Now, the next topic is stupas. From our understanding, we have seen that Buddhism or the idea behind Buddhism came to be through a lot of interactions with many other traditions, including Brahmanism, Jainism, and several other isms that existed at that time. Now, although not all of these interactions were put down to text or to were prescribed in literature, we also see that these interactions made their way into how spaces were identified or buildings were created. Now, from the earliest times, sacred spaces were identified by maybe a tree which was a certain way, or a natural occurrence of rocks which looked a certain way, or even a forest. And oftentimes a little shrine would be attached to the space, and that would be called the chaitya. As a side note, it is also believed, or it is argued, that the word chaitya could also have been derived from the word chitta, which means a funeral pyre or a funeral mound. Now, the Buddhist literature also mentions several chaityas, and it identifies important chaityas that were connected to the life of Buddha. For example, the one at Lumbini, which is connected to his birth, the one at Bodh Gaya, which is connected to his enlightenment, the one at Sarnath, which is connected to his first sermon, and the one at Kusinagra, which is connected to his Nibbana. Now, eventually, all these spaces gathered an importance of their own, and we know from Ashoka, when he visited Lumbini nearly 200 years later, that he erected an iron pillar to mark his presence there. Now, this was about the chaityas, but what was the purpose of the stupas and why were they built? Now, stupas are basically mounds that contain artifacts of the Buddha, or his the physical remnants of the Buddha. They could be a part of him, or they could have been objects that he used throughout his life. And because they are revered, because these items are revered, the stupa in itself also gained the same reverence. Now, the practice of building a stupa might have been pre-Buddhist, but it gained importance as a Buddhist structure, and it sort of merged into Buddhism, and it became a symbol of Buddha and Buddhism. According to the Ashoka Vandana, which is a Buddhist text, it mentions that Emperor Ashok collected and distributed the relics of Buddha throughout the subcontinent, and had stupas built over them. And by the 2nd century BCE, you have stupas coming up in spaces like Bharut, Sanchi, and Sarnath.
Now, how are the stupas built? So, inscriptions on the railings of the stupas and pillars that decorated the stupas, they always tell you about the donations made by the people who made these stupas. Kings made donations, like Satavahanas made donations, and their names are mentioned on these stupas. Then we have guild workers, ivory workers, who kind of donated money for the gates, the eastern gate of Sanchi. Then you have women, men who've made donations, and their name being inscribed on the railings of the stupas, and also the place of their origin, the place they came from. You also have bhikkhus and bhikkhunis donating money for the construction of stupas. The structure of stupa. So stupa actually means a heap of earth. Heap on earth, or heap of earth. It's a Sanskrit word, and it actually depicts, it's like a semicircular mound that looks like an anda. Okay. Us ande ke upar you have the harmika, which is like a balcony, which also symbolizes abode of God. Over the harmika you have a yashti, a mast, a yashti, and surmounted by a chhatri. And then you have a separate railing around the mound that separates the mount from the secular world. The early stupas at Sanchi and at Bharuch, they were more simple, but their railings were more elaborate. Their railings were decorated nicely, and they actually had these railings would have four. Would be at four cardinal corners. Worshippers entered through the eastern gate and they kind of walked around the mount, keeping the mount on their right side. It's like a parikrama that you do.
Yeah.
And basically following the path of sun, how the sun follows a path in the sky. That's the whole idea around it. But you find more elaborate stupas and more carved and with more decorated stupas in Amravati and Shahji Ki Dairy, which is in Peshawar.
The next topic is discovering stupas, the fate of Amravati and Sanchi. Now, it is of course important to know the history of how a site was developed into a sacred site or how a stupa was built at a sacred site. But what is also important, considering our history and considering our colonial legacy, is how many of these ancient sites were discovered. In 1796, a local Raja decided to build a temple and he stumbled upon the ruins of Amravati and he decided to use the stone from the stupa there. He also thought that he might find some form of treasure, so there was some amount of desecration that also happened. Some years later, a British official by the name of Colin Mackenzie visited the site and he found several sculptures there and he also drew sketches of some of them, but nothing came out of this exercise. It was never published. In 1854, Walter Elliot, who was the commissioner of Guntur in Andhra Pradesh, visited Amravati and he collected several of the marble slabs and transported them to Madras, and these were called the Elliot marbles after him. He also discovered the remains of the Western Gate at Amravati and it led him to state that the structure at Amravati was one of the most magnificent Buddhist sites in the world. By the 1850s, we can see that some structures from Amravati were being transported to the Asiatic Society in Bengal, to the Indian Post in Madras, even to London. It was very common for British officials to carry away these sculptures to be used as garden pieces or as decoration just because they were available. The excuse was that officials before them had done it, so they could do it too. Now, one of the few officials who had a different point of opinion was an archaeologist by the name of H.H. Cole, and he wrote, and I quote, "It seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art." He believed that the original structures should remain in the place where they were found, or in situ, which is where they were built. He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimiles of the structures, whereas the original should stay in its parent location. And while he was not able to convince the authorities in the case of Amravati, luckily we were able to do something about in situ preservation when it came to Sanchi. One wonders why the site at Amravati could not be preserved, whereas the site at Sanchi fared better. Some argue that it was because Amravati was discovered at a time when scholars had not fully grasped or understood the importance of preserving artifacts in situ, or where they are found. When Sanchi was discovered in 1818, 3 of its gateways still stood intact, and the 4th was lying close by. And through a variety of factors that were discussed at the beginning of the chapter, we can see that we were able to preserve Sanchi. And while there were discussions about taking the Eastern Gateway either to museums in France or London, we were able to keep it within the country, and through a variety of factors we were able to preserve Sanchi to a better extent. Unfortunately, the Mahachaitya at Amravati was not preserved, or could not enjoy the same benefits as Sanchi, and it is now completely reduced to a mound, and it is completely denuded of its former glory.
Sculpture. So we have seen how they have how the British or the French, basically Europeans, they removed many artifacts and sculptures from our important sites, ancient sites, and took them because they liked them in the first place to their home country. So what were these sculptures? So one of them was a it's called a Charan Chitra, basically a scroll that depicts a story. So in this, basically, we actually see a sculpture. The sculpture seems to depict a rural scene with thatched huts and trees. However, art historians who have carefully studied the sculpture at Sanchi identify it as a scene from the Visantara Jatak. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to a Brahmin and went to live in the forest with his wife and children. Art historians, they tried to be very familiar with the hagiographies of Buddha to understand Buddhist sculptures. So in many of these sculptures you will see Gautam Buddha meditating under a tree, and while attaining nirvana, while enlightenment, and in many cases they will not show Buddha sitting under a tree but an empty seat. They will not show him in a human form. MTC, that means he is trying to gain the nirvana, or you call it Mahaparinirvana. And then you have also symbols being associated with him, like the wheel that symbolizes his first sermon at Sarnath. And such sculptures cannot just be understood in a very easy manner, because in certain ways they would show a tree, but that tree is just not a tree, could kind of tell you about a part of Buddha's life. So a lot of correlation, a lot of familiarity with that time, with their text and with the sculptures was important to understand these sculptures. Other sculptures at Sanchi, they depict something else. So there are many sculptures at Sanchi that don't really tell you about the Buddhist traditions. For example, there's a woman who's hanging from a tree. And that has nothing to do with renunciation. That has nothing to do with what Buddha was trying to preach. So they were just there for to attract people because they looked beautiful, or at times they were auspicious. For example, this particular sculpture depicted that through her touch, the trees started bearing fruit. So something that is, auspicious at that point of time.
Because oftentimes people would also bring in their own beliefs and practices to the fold of Buddhism.
Yeah, that happened because when people joined Buddhism, so a lot of their pre-Buddhist traditions, they brought that with them.
And that got assimilated to the Buddhist practice.
And they were shown on the sculptures also because to attract more viewers, to attract more people. And this particular female who is hanging from a tree is known as Shala Bhanjika. Not only humans were depicted in these sculptures, animals too were depicted, and they were magnificent. Elephants were depicted, horses, monkeys, cattle were depicted. Also in the Jataka tales you will see stories based on animals and they having human attributes, moral stories. And all these depiction of animals also had certain kind of thought behind it. For example, each animal depicted a human attribute. For example, elephant meant strength and wisdom. Another motif is of a woman being surrounded by lotuses and elephants sprinkling water on her, more like an abhishek. So a lot of people said that woman was Maya, who was Lord Buddha's mother, or could be many people, historians, they say no, it's Gajalakshmi, she is the goddess of fortune. Many people, historians, are confused. Some say she's Maya, and others they say she's Gajalakshmi. But not all motives or the meanings were written or written in text or being jotted down by people, because there is one where there's serpents being drawn on the pillars. So I think all based on popular traditions, but not the symbolism is not known, because there was one art historian called James Ferguson. He thought that this was a place where people worshipped serpents. So that means that not everything was written, not everything. So people basically had their own assumptions around it.
Now, the next topic is new religious traditions. By the 1st century CE, we can see that Buddhism has also begun to change in its beliefs and practices. While in the earlier school of thought, your own efforts were important to attain nirvana, and Buddha in itself was seen as a normal person, a regular human being who attained salvation through his own efforts. But as time moved on, there was a sense of like a savior complex that developed within the lay people, and Buddha was seen as a savior, and he was being worshipped as if the key to salvation rested with him. Simultaneously, the concept of bodhisattvas also emerged, and bodhisattvas were, beings who had amassed a lot of goodwill through their penance, but instead of moving on and renouncing the world and attaining salvation, they used their good merits in helping others attaining salvation. Gradually, the worship of the image of the Buddha and the bodhisattvas also gained a lot of importance, and this school of thought began to call themselves the Mahayana school of thought. They looked at the older way of worshipping as lesser than them and would call them Hinayanas, although the people who continued to practice Buddhism in the older way, they called themselves the Theravedas, who would follow the way of the Theras or the Gurus of the old. Now, Mahayana literally is also called the greater vehicle, and in comparison, Hinayana is called the lesser vehicle.
The savior complex was not only limited to Buddhism. We see that in other cultures and traditions as well, even in Hinduism, where the two sects emerged, Vaishnavism and Shaivism. Vaishnavism is associated with Lord Vishnu, where Vishnu is the chief deity, and you have a set of devotees following him. And then you have Shaivism, where Shiva is the chief god, and you have sets of devotees. And the relationship that the devotees have with him is of devotion and love and bhakti. In the case of Vaishnavism, we see cults being formed around his incarnation. So 10 incarnations have been associated with Vishnu, and then you have followers following them, and one of his avatar would come to earth, and there's a disorder, destruction. That incarnation would act as a savior. So this was also done in a way to grow, so that the concept of this institution of Vaishnavism should grow. So you have these stories around it. You have that he's a savior and he's saving the world, and so that more followers would get attracted to this whole institution. And some of these deities were represented in sculptures, or a kind of symbol was attached to them. For example, Shiva is also associated as Linga, and many times you could see these deities in human forms also, and many of them have different attributes that was only associated with them, like their weapon, how they're seated, what are they holding in their hand, a particular, for example, how Trishul is associated with Lord Shiva. A ling is associated with Lord Shiva. With Vishnu, you will see Sudarshan Chakra associated, or a Shankh is associated with him, or a lotus is also associated. But you have these symbols that you would see, look at that symbol, and कि इन देवता की भक्ति होती है यहाँ पे, और या इन या तो वैष्णविज्म है या शैविज्म है कि इन डेटी की यहाँ भक्ति होती है, because we start associating such symbols with them. To understand the meaning of these sculptures, the historians started reading more information and reading more text written up regarding the sculptures. Purans were read, which were compiled by the Brahmins, and these were spread across generations to generations, though written in simple Sanskrit language, but they were said out loud so that people who were not allowed to read Purans, like women and the Shudras, they could also hear them. And they were basically, Purans had in Purans you will find praises written in the name of gods and goddesses about them. And most of the Purans also you find dialogues that took place between various people, and also how they spread across generations. Purans also had instances and thoughts about people's interactions when they traveled from place to place, like women, priests, merchants. And one such example is that Vasudev Krishna was an important deity in Mathura, and how their worship spread across the whole subcontinent.
Now, around the time that the stupas, like the one at Sanchi, were being built or they were taking form, the earliest temples to house the images of Puranic gods and goddesses were also being made. Initially, the temple was just a square room called the Garbhagriha with only the gateway or a door meant for the worshipper to go inside, offer worship, and come out. Over time, a tall structure was built on top of the central shrine, and this was called the Shikhara. Now, temple walls were often decorated with sculpture, and as time progressed, the temple structure in itself also became more elaborate, with the simple Garbhagriha being like there were additions made, like an assembly hall or decorated walls or huge gateways. Even arrangements were made for water. One unique feature of some early temples was that they were made out of hollowed caves that were sort of made out of huge rocks. Now, the tradition to build an artificial cave was not a new one. At the earliest, there was a few caves that were commissioned by Emperor Ashoka, who got them made for renouncers that belonged to an Ajivika sect.
Because his mother was also, she also belonged to the Ajivika sect. That could be the reason that he commissioned them.
Now, the practice of building temples out of huge rocks or building temples in artificial caves gradually evolved through the years, and we see the culmination of this art by the 8th century in the temple complex of Kailashnath in Ellora, and how that was created out of a single rock.
And it is associated with Shiva?
Kailashnath, yes, it is.
Oh.
There is even a copper plate inscription where the chief sculptor sort of, is just so amazed कि वाह मैंने बना दिया. Like it literally just says that.
By now we have a glimpse of what these sculptures were, why were they constructed, why were they sculpted by the people of that time. Many were destroyed over a period of time. Now that what we see is the preserved part. But what we know of it, is it exactly how people also thought 2000 years ago is the question. They also perceive it in that similar manner, because initially when in the 19th century, when the Europeans they discovered these sculptures and these buildings, they wanted to understand what exactly it is, but they were mostly petrified and scared of how the sculptures were with multiple hands and how gruesome they were.
Yeah,
because they didn't
consider it very
they
horrific.
actually thought of it as a horrifying scene, or mostly satanic, because they were ignorant of the tradition that was there in the past, and they had no idea. So these scholars, they try to make a sense of it by relating the sculptures with that they were familiar with, basically the Greek sculptures of the ancient Greek civilization, and they always found our Indian sculptures inferior to that. When they found statues of Buddha and Bodhisattva that were sculpted by the Indo-Greek rulers in Taxila, Peshawar, they kind of reminded them of this Greek sculpture, and they were really excited because they looked very Greek in their attributes, because obviously the Indo-Greek got their own style of sculpting various sculptures, and these sculptures made by the Indo-Greeks, Buddhist sculptures and sculptures of bodhisattvas, was one of the fine examples. So what they did was they were trying to correlate what was familiar to understand the unfamiliar.
Yeah.
Right?
We've already spoken about this in earlier chapters, how that is somehow something that historians would use, or they used to do, how you go from the known to the unknown. But it's not always the right thing to do, or it's not always the way where you can get correct answers.
Yeah.
Or answers that fit, basically.
Yeah, basically because I don't know what people thought of those things in the past, how they understood it, or why were they constructed for them. Now we use what we believe in and we try to correlate.
Yeah,
Right.
and also at that time, there's also like this perception of how you are viewing at an artifact
Yeah.
through a colonial lens.
Yeah.
As opposed to like
How it must be.
yeah.
But what if the text and the sculpture or the image, they don't match? That is also a problem,
Yeah.
because whenever you see a particular sculpture, art historians would read up text to understand that particular thing. But what if they don't match? Because there is one instance where there's a rock sculpture that is carved rock in Mahabalipuram, where they're depicting a story. So a lot of historians, they started looking at Purans, they started researching what exactly it depicts, so that if there is a mention of this depiction in any of those texts, and they're divided when it comes to opinion around it, because some say that you see river Ganga flowing because there's a cleft in between, and others believe that it's actually from the time of Mahabharat, a story is depicted in this, where Arjun is meditating on the river near the river to gain arms. So people keep getting even nowadays, when you look at a particular scene that has been sculpted on a rock, you would have your own opinion, you would have your own research, what is it depicting, then you look for information, but you can't be certain, because at times it doesn't match up.
Exactly, because what was the artist imagining when he was creating his work? So
Because
till the time
we try to relate it to the colonial aspects, we try to relate it to the day-to-day things also, but how did people perceive it at that time?
Yeah.
What was going inside the mind of the sculptor?
And many images held a certain amount of relevance, which might have been lost just in time.
Do not forget to go through the blue boxes and the purplish boxes, because those are very important. With this chapter, we end with the first book. We would request you to go through the chapters by yourself as well, because by chance we have missed out on a point, and it's better that you also go through it once. That's all for today. Like, share and subscribe, and keep watching Tariq.